Welcome to the Inquiring Spirit podcast. I'm Ravi Joseph. I'm here with Bharath and Ravi. Thanks, Bharath, for joining me this morning. How are you?
Good, Ravi. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing well. So today we're talking about the essay "Life After Lifestyle" by Toby Shorin. It's a pretty seminal essay that came out in 2022, and I thought it was really interesting. I've come back to it over the years to try to understand what's going on. So I thought we could discuss it this morning. I'll briefly open with an introduction, just an overview of the essay, and also why I thought it was kind of significant and worthy of being brought in for this podcast.
Perfect.
Um, so the essay has to do with a change that Shorin perceives happening in marketing and culture, where in the 2010s, products were marketed by attaching them to pre-existing internet subcultures, whereas now Shorin notices a trend where companies are actually making culture itself and then attaching products to be marketed on top of that. So to unpack that a little, in the 2010s, there were these DTC brands, direct to consumer brands, that started to overtake brands from conventional brands that we know from the past. So instead of a Serta mattress, you buy a Casper DTC mattress, or instead of a Gillette razor, you buy a Dollar Shave Club razor. And these were fueled by the cost effectiveness of ads on platforms like Facebook. So Shorin asks, why do these have meaning? Why would you really care if you buy a commodity from one brand versus another? And the answer is because the internet is sorting people into different subcultures where these complexes of knowledge and values and aesthetics, personality, and marketers found ways of associating products with these subcultures so that the products gained meaning. So it's this mysterious process through which these mundane products that are, commodities, and in our kind of nihilistic age, we just see them as just a lump of matter that has no intrinsic meaning. Through this process of marketing and subcultural transformation, becomes invested with this kind of aura of this object that is kind of desirable and filled with meaning. So, um, yeah, so the subcultures produce meaning for people, and then the brands are associated to subcultures. But Shorin asks, what if this actually needs to go further, and what if this is actually going further to the point where brands are actually creating cultures themselves? So in the essay, he kind of investigates what exactly culture is, and finds that it's this process of moral formation, or we've talked about the idea of Bildung in some of our private conversations, which is this German term meaning this way that people become selves by this process of experience and ideas coming into their kind of moral being. So it seems strange, the idea that companies could kind of create culture. What does that even mean? But Shorin finds that there are these commercial projects that are blurring the lines between creating cultural objects and culture itself, um, versus culture traditionally being thought of in terms of this kind of thing that happens outside the sphere of the marketplace. So examples he gives are the crypto scene, where there are these different ideologies and ways of being that are kind of attached to this um, to these new financial instruments, and Soul Cycle, this subculture where people get really to biking, and then it becomes almost a thing where the culture kind of overtakes the actual product. So why is this interesting? Why are we discussing marketing and brands and products on a philosophy podcast? Um, so I read this essay through the lens of the meaning crisis, which is kind of John Vervaeke's term for this breakdown in narratives of what people found meaningful in the era before modernity versus in modernity, where religious narratives breaking down, cultural narratives breaking down, and we find ourselves not really engaging with the structures of society and culture in a way that feels nourishing to us or meaningful to us or something that we want to participate in. And I've experienced this countless times, sitting in my room, sitting in as if it's like this void of meaning, and there's these structures of my life, of school or work or things that don't seem like they really relate to what's going on inside my spirit, and not knowing what that thing is that kind of corresponds to my inner being. But the structures that Shorin identifies seems to be like what is coming up that will provide meaning in people's lives, and increasingly. Um, so I wasn't that engaged with the culture in 2000, around the early 2010s when he talks about the DTC brands. So I didn't have the experience of like participating in these subcultures where DTC brands give meaning. But I have been getting increasingly engaged with the internet subcultures more recently, and I know that for myself, some of the most recent meaningful experiences that I've had are in these kind of private internet communities where value systems and aesthetics are reinforced around things like spirituality or poetry or intellectual discussion. So I definitely think that there is something to this idea that culture is being created in these ways through the internet. So you and I, Bharath, we find setting aside the essay, I know that we disagree a lot about metaphysics and the nature of the ultimate, what's the actual metaphysical structure of the universe. But I think an area of convergence for us is the recognition that the structures of life have to be meaningful without reference to a transcendental God. So I think a good example of this is let's say we go to a concert. The ultimate determiner of whether the concert is enjoyable is whether it matches our aesthetic sensibilities, and not really whether it refers to God or anything like that. And same with any of these other cultural objects. Um, Art has to be fulfilling in itself, or moral sensibilities have to be fulfilling themselves without reference um, to God. And I think that's where this notion of culture being created comes in. Um, so I do see these kinds of new aesthetic and cultural formations coming on their way, like these people building new cities, which are going to have through things like the network state and the network society that we've talked about again privately with Balaji Srinivasan. So there are these people trying to form new communities of people in new cities with different value systems and different aesthetics associated with that, or even outside those cities, new art projects, new moral sensibilities, creation of novel experiences through VR. And I think a lot of them are going to be mediated in this way where they're not necessarily these like not for profit cultural activities, but are going to be mediated by the profit motive in various ways. Um, and so I think that aligns very much with what Shorin's pointing out about these kind of new kind of commercial structures that create culture. So I think there's something that has a hold on the liberal imagination in particular, where we should just be satisfied culturally by the public library and just be happy with that. Just have this community that's devoid of financial participation. But I think the actual cultural energy is going towards these kinds of creation of culture in this commercially mediated way, and that um, and Shorin, the interesting thing is that Shorin thinks that this might be okay. He kind of makes peace with that this might be better than the nihilistic, kind of meaningless, structuralist world that we were participating in, that it might be better in some sense if we kind of lean into this. And so I'm inclined to agree with him. So that's an overview of the essay and some of my comments on it. I think it's definitely worth reading the essay itself. If you haven't read it, I'll link to it in the notes because there's a lot more in there that I didn't get to touch on. So I'd love to hear what you thought about it, Barth.
I think that's an excellent summary. And thank you for introducing me to this essay. I hadn't read it before. You mentioned it. I hadn't heard of him. I found it just a fantastic piece, really thought-provoking. It sort of made me curious about who he was, and I was sort of looking at his website and, seeing that, yeah, he's very interested in, I think, some of the things that we're interested in, and sort of that he's sort of trying to think about the relation between technology and culture and spirituality, wellness, and sort of seeing where things are going. And yeah, I would echo pretty much what you said, and I'll say what I think what jumped out to me is when I was reading it. I mean, a lot of the references I didn't catch in terms of brands because they're not in my wheelhouse, really either. But I get the I think I know what he's talking about. So I got the feeling, right, in terms of okay, this is what's happening in 2010, and I was like, well, I was not aware of any of these things in 2010, this kind of thing, right? But in a way, that's partly what I found compelling is I experience myself as somebody who is coming into the internet world, right? And I was reading Shorin as somebody who is totally seeped in it, right? Not just internet world, but in the world of business and branding and, the people who are transitioning onto the internet. A lot of the activities and how business and branding and is going with that. And while I was reading the essay, the feeling I had was I was sort of thinking of an analogy. The analogy was sort of when uh, the pilgrims were coming to America, or a lot of these British folks were coming to America in the 1600s or early 1700s, right? There was a way in which England sort of was England and Europe were the old world, and the sort of the religious landscape of that old world wasn't working for them, right? They were feeling sort of persecuted, isolated, feeling that they would rather brave, being on the ocean for 2 months and going, to this unknown continent to them to start a new life over being in that old setup and sort of feeling persecuted and isolated. And I think part of the way I read him was that the move to sort of the way that our culture is being formed by sort of our business branding and the internet is a little like that new world, right? And we're sort of entering this new space where our interactions are very much mediated through this new technology, the new ways in which we interact with brands, the way we sort of are defined by what we eat, what we wear, what kind of communities we form online, or how we identify with things. And so there's a lot to be said for about how when people came to America, that triggered new forms of spirituality. It kickstarted a certain kind of individuality in their spiritual revolution here with the Great Awakening, and then later again, with transcendentalism and so forth. And I kind of was thinking that speaking to the question of what is this question of branding have to do with the spiritual landscape or philosophical landscape? And the answer to me seemed to be that in a way, the essay is speaking to what counts as culture for us now, right? What counts as being cultured? What counts as having ideals and trying to grow? And he's sort of giving a really interesting layout of the land as he sees it, and how we're sort of permeated by sort of advertising, and where the advertising has changed from, 100 years ago, it was, you know, this is what the elite or the rich people, or this is what the cultured people are sort of what they're doing. And this will get you kind of to be like that. And to 2010, it was okay. It's not going to, there's not this one setup, but it'll introduce you to all these subcultures to where I think he's sort of saying things have sort of gotten turbocharged where now the brand is itself somehow the culture. It's not an intermediary to something, right? And I think that resonated for me very powerfully. I think we're certainly seeing that in politics. I think that's one way to think about what I think is really attractive for a lot of people about Trump, that the way in which he resonates for people is in this kind of new key, right? And I also think that it speaks to maybe even the sort of philosophical spiritual landscape, that it's something that I sort of been feeling for some years, but I didn't know how to phrase it until this essay sort of, I think, gave the language to phrase it. Because I sort of think that, Eckhart Tolle, Satguru, uh, sort of now, sort of when people see all these videos that have been come up recently of Alan Watts that have been published on YouTube, right? In a way, uh, Deepak Chopra, all these thinkers are brands now. I think that the idea that there is sort of these spiritual figures who are sort of out of the realm of, the way that we think about McDonald's and Gap and, uh, sort of Amazon, there's this feeling that okay, that's all happening in sort of this everyday world, but then spirituality is sort of someplace else. That's sort of a higher calling, right? And I think I felt for some years that no, these things have kind of started to fuse together in some deep way. And I think Shorin really articulated, I think that really well, the way in which they're fused together, where the brands themselves are evolving towards becoming more like communities. They speak to community. They speak to, Shorin at one point references, I think, this book from about 40 years ago, The Lonely Crowd, or maybe it was even at this point 40, 50 years ago, The Lonely Crowd, speaking about how, sort of in America, we're kind of isolated, and that this branding has substituted for the sense of culture. And so yeah, so if all these questions of loneliness and community, identity, somehow these are now they're so deeply interwoven with what it means to be spiritual or philosophical, are now somehow inseparable from questions of branding, how you stand out from the crowd, how you, especially now on this sort of social media world space, internet space, there are thousands and millions of people who are sort of competing for the attention space, and the branding is sort of how you get heard. And that is all part and parcel of our space. And whether that could be about how you sort of what clothes you wear to what spiritual beliefs you have and how you share it, they've all sort of gotten into the same mix. And how do we make sense of that? So that's what I found really interesting about it.
Yeah, great comments. Um, with this idea of the pilgrims coming over to America, I was thinking of um, some observations that Tanner Greer, another essayist, has made about how in the 19th century America, there was this tendency for Americans to kind of have this conception of kind of democratic self-governance, which wasn't just about who you vote for every 4 years, but this ethos of kind of communally making these voluntary organizations, taking responsibility for things in your local community, and and solving problems without needing to kind of speaking to the manager or appealing to the bureaucratic state, but taking this kind of cultural ethos that went into it as well, and that was yeah, brought about by the conditions that you're mentioning of these pilgrims coming to the frontier, and that led to these new forms of culture. Um, so uh, I think those structures might not come back today, but they're really going to be these new forms of organization where there are going to be people that are attracting people from different geographical locations around the same sets of values. Whereas in the past, it was more based on who are the people that you voluntarily work for in your local community. Um, but I think it's correct that this conception of coming to the new world kind of restructures our value system. So that I think that was an interesting analogy, and yeah, I'd like to hear more about that if you want to go into it. But yeah, I'll comment on one other thing and then go deeper on another point.
Okay.
So I think you're right about politics being another place where this issue of branding comes to the fore, um, because who you vote for is no longer just this kind of rational determination of the pros and cons of a certain decision and here are the effects of that decision, but something that deeply speaks to your identity, your aesthetics, your way of being, and it's no longer um, yeah, no longer just about and maybe it never was about that. I don't know how it was in the early 20th century or the 19th century. Um, but yeah, it's deeply about this question of branding. Um, yeah, so to go deeper on this idea of spirituality, I think is really interesting, because something for me that I've been trying to figure out is what exactly makes something spiritual versus not spiritual, and it's very difficult to determine around the edges. Like is it this feeling of devotion that I have for God or for the guru? Um, that is certainly a spiritual feeling, but if you unpack that feeling, it's based on these feelings that we have in our human lives, and it's related to these feelings that we might have had for other people in our lives, and then we're transposing it to this kind of supernatural domain, and it's so what really makes that spiritual, or what makes an action spiritual? And I think the answers are a lot less clear. Not that there are no guidelines for our actions at all, but what I mean is that it's unclear where the boundary between spirituality is and between these domains like culture or philosophy or ethoses or doctrines of how we live life. If I live my life according to the Peter Thiel startup playbook, that's kind of an ethos that you should, you know, come up with inventive ideas and execute on them, um, and um, and be contrarian about, deferring with conventional wisdom to create these ideas. So is that's not really so the connection that I'm around with spirituality is that that's like a way of life, and um and it inspires certain emotions in you, and the same thing with a spiritual way of life where you are kind of uh maybe living in a different way, but doing certain spiritual practices. And not to say that there's an equivalence between those two things, but it's not clear, like, is it the actions that you take, or is it the feelings that are engendered, or what exactly is it, where exactly is this locus of spirituality? And I think one of the most powerful, so all of that said, I do, practice spiritual practices in a conventional sense, and um I believe that all that is spiritual, but it's difficult for me to see what exactly the difference is between that and another way of being that is not necessarily spiritual. So the connection I want to make between that and your comment about these different brands of spiritual teachers is that I find one of the most compelling arguments for what exactly these spiritual teachers are doing is that they really are, in a sense, kind of cults of personalities, um, and not in a way that is negative, but in a way that is positive, and that is actually fine. I think, obviously we don't want to give up on our rationality, we don't want to give up on our sovereignty, but uh, there's a powerful effect that just the personality of a teacher can have on the way you kind of structure yourself, your orientations, your values. Um, and I think that's a lot of what's going on in this new wave of. So Shorin didn't just talk as much about the influencer economy and the creator economy, but that's a big part of what this sorting into subcultures is about. Um, so uh, these personalities kind of create the effect of a spiritual personality is multi-leveled. Um, so just holding their energy as a person kind of creates this field of orientation towards kind of holding your own energy in a certain way. Then there, but this personality is not this unitary thing where it's just this abstract vibration, but it's expressed in words and thoughts and all this complex of things. So and the way that it operates is not just necessarily straightforward or linear. Like, so Sri Aurobindo was my primary spiritual influence, and he had a personality and a certain energy, but people can be influenced not just by the abstract doctrines he preached in the Life Divine, but also by these more unexpected aspects of her personality. So one thing that I noticed was interesting was that many of his male disciples ended up becoming poets, because he had a strong interest in poetry, and that rubbed off on an aspirational activity that these male disciples. I mean, there's so many activities in the world. There's horseback riding, there's archery, there's Brazilian jiu-jitsu, there's
Right.
all these different things that one could be involved with. But because Sri Aurobindo is interested in this one particular activity, a lot of his other And I say male disciples not because of a gender thing. With I just uh, objectively noticing that there was this in the culture of the Sri Aurobindo ashram at the time, there was this kind of a little bit of a gendered skew in the male disciples taking up poetry and the female disciples taking up other disciplines. And yeah, we can critique that, and I'm fine with that. As that maybe that's not the healthiest kind of division of why people do that. But yeah, just again, objectively, that's what happened. Um, but that is to say that yeah, these aspects of spiritual personalities can rub off in different unexpected directions. So I think the current wave of kind of spiritual teacher brands is that um, so first of all, there's not really a difference between spiritual teacher brands and like personal development teacher brands and just any sort of brand whatsoever. Like I've been noticing, I came across this interesting. So there's another kind of phenomena is this phenomena um, of these kind of business influencers who teach ways of making a living. So that's a completely different space. But I came across one of these business influencers the other day who's packaging not only the way of making a living, but combining that with this ethos of authenticity that he preaches as a conduit to making that living in um yeah, I don't want to call anybody out because I'm not saying it's a negative thing at all. I think it's really interesting this kind of personality ethos combined with this other business skill. And so it's this kind of like personal development brand where you're becoming yourself through personal development, but also developing this business skill in a way that's kind of packaged together. And I think that's a way that people are going to be increasingly going towards. So what I'm seeing is not just not just this thing where there's this category of spiritual influencers who just preach about meditation and this way of being, but this whole spectrum of kind of these cults of personality where people are teaching different aspects of what they do. They might be teaching, yeah, together with a skill or together with a intellectual interest or together with a hobby. They kind of package themselves into these um, yeah, complexes of like Shorin says, culture um, that are yeah, not divisible in a way that they were before. Um, yeah, so the last connection, and I think this is kind of harkening back to like kind of the original conception of religion as this way of life, where it's not an abstract thing of we live life and then we go to a temple and recite abstract prayers to an abstract god, but religion's ethos that governs not just what we do outside inside the temple, but it governs our whole code of conduct in our jobs as the farmer or as the warrior or whatever else. It's this kind of overarching ethos that connects the abstract ideas to the concrete materials of life. So I see that all getting reorganized in this interesting way. And that's what I thought was relevant about your comments about these spiritual teachers becoming brands in this way.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I think one thing that I'll just read this sentence that jumped out to me from the essay here.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there are two sentences that jumped out to me, which I think speak to exactly what we're talking about. One is he says at one point, brands are meanings that structure our relationships. They're already the same sort of thing that a religion or a culture is. And then a little later on, he says, the realization that producing culture is about producing types of personhood is the central issue of this new cultural economy, right? So I think that's sort of exactly what I think you're saying in describing his view and sort of when you were articulating your ideas here. I think that there is, I think I think Shorin himself seems to be ambiguous or ambivalent about it. And then you can sort of see him, yeah, in the essay does a good job of sort of, you know, moving to, yeah, maybe this is okay. Maybe it's okay that this is happening, right? And it looks like he wrote this essay over many years. Perhaps he kind of shifted in along the way. And yeah, I put myself in the category of I think this is great. I think that's exactly what should happen, or what, well, should or not. I think it is what seems to me natural to happen is that uh, the idea that a person we have our jobs, we have our families, we have sort of our sort of going to the movies, our entertainment, and then there is you go to church or meditation or read philosophy books. That compartmentalization is itself, it's not like it's been like that forever, right? I mean, that particular way in which our lives are structured to some extent was a creation of the last, say, 400 years, right? Before then, in different societies, these things were all interconnected in various different ways, right? And so we just sort of gotten used to one way of defining them, so that if one goes into a Barnes and Noble and sort of sees all these sort of categories that are set up, where okay, you have spirituality here, you have self-help here, you have history here, and business here, and so forth. These are not categories that are somehow etched into the universe. These are not like objective in that way. Rather, these are categories that have sort of come up and which are now getting reoriented, where precisely because those categories, the way that they've been structured, aren't working for a lot of people, right? I mean, I think, so uh, I enjoy my job. I'm able to do that part and then do philosophy on the side, or no, when I'm not working. But I think, is this an ideal way of having one's life? Well, I mean, one would I mean, this idea of having some kind of a unity to our life is, I think, a valuable aspiration, right? And not just sort of, okay, I'm doing this to make money, and then I'm doing this to sort of grow myself, as a person, right? I think even it's internal to the way that we want to have jobs that's part of our growth. That's part, but now once you say it's part of our growth, it's natural to ask, well, okay, well, how is that part of my personal growth also? Not just, oh, that's my professional growth, but okay, well, what is it like for me personally? When the older religious or spiritual or communal structures were, I think, felt meaningful to people, it was easier to compartmentalize or even to see them as nested dolls. Oh, having that job is part of how you're part of the community, because the job itself is part of a community. Your family and friends might understand or whatever. And, but if now those things are all changing, then I think the question becomes not only what should I believe, or what should I do, but rather who should I be? Like what kind of a person should I be? And and how should I be? Like how should I think about my life, right? And when one thinks like that, I think it is very natural to look around you and go, okay, who should I be like? Not what beliefs do they have exactly, right? Or do I agree with all of their beliefs? Not, okay, you know, uh, but rather, is there something about their being that sort of speaks to me and evokes something in me, right? And that's a sense in which it is sort of based on sort of producing. Culture has always been about producing types of personhood, right? It's about saying, hey, this is the kind of person you should strive to be. And part of what's happened now, which wasn't the case as much in the past, is the idea that each person gets to pursue their own personhood has become more dominant, right? As opposed to, okay, your sense of personhood is given by your class or your sort of position in society. Now that's gotten a little more, not entirely, but a little more streamlined. So I think it's I think the kind of thing Shoren's talking about seems to me just psychologically very astute and sort of intuitive. That people don't respond to, well, let me find the beliefs that Christ held, therefore I will follow Christ, right? Like I like, verse 72 of the Gospel of John. That's why I agree with Christ. I think that's not sort of, I think, how it works. What it works is something about the branding of Christ as a type of person speaks to one, right? And I think this is where, whenever we have these kind of revolutions in culture, like what we're going through, what Shorin is pointing at, it kind of sheds a new light on the past, right? And one of the lights that it sheds for me on the past is absolutely Socrates, Christ, Buddha, Confucius, these are all brands. These are not just people. We're not really speaking just to these individual people because we don't really know who the individual person of Christ was or Socrates was, right? Or even Plato, Aristotle. What we're interested in is these historical, maybe mythological figures sometimes become these brands of who we want to be like, right? And that happens even with people who are recently, so like for example, I was very influenced by the philosopher Wittgenstein, but I tried to continually sort of remind myself that what I'm interested in isn't the historical actual Wittgenstein per se, right? I'm interested in sort of and I think this kind of Shorin's way of speaking really gives a new language for what I feel is I'm interested in the brand of Wittgenstein, right? Because I'm not interested in the actual person, because there are all sorts of things I don't resonate with the actual person. The ways in which the actual person fell short of his own branding, the way he branded himself with people, the way he presented himself with people. So in a way, what I'm interested in is what is that? What is the way he presented himself? What is the way he wanted to be, right? And that is what I think is that aspirational dimension is the brand, right? And then something about it speaks, something about it at a personality level, something at a gut level, which I can explicate, right? Just like, you could explain what are the things about Aurobindo or whoever that speak to you. But at root, it is something almost subconscious that is internalizing all of our different values, our different life situation, our narratives to sort of latch on to someone, right? And so I think so one reason I am fully on board the idea of seeing how everything is really a brand in our life is it forces us to take responsibility for our values and for who we find inspiring, right? If we sort of say, well, Wittgenstein was the greatest philosopher of if I speak like that, Wittgenstein was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and here are the things that he believed. In a way, what I'm doing is sort of treating it like this is an objective fact. I'll tell you the reasons why he's the best. And now I'll convince you and everybody else, and we're all going to get on the same page, right? That is a kind of way of speaking I could have that many people do have, even about Wittgenstein or anybody else. To me, that feels a little disingenuous because that doesn't speak to maybe why he speaks to me, because he speaks to me something about I find a similarity between his life and my life, and something about it resonates for me, right? And so I think it's better to be honest about that. It's better to be honest that, hey, here's why he speaks to me, and here's the kind of aspiration that speaks to me. And I am, as somebody who's speaking to people, I'm going to make my aspiration explicit and sort of present it as, yes, that is what it is. It's a brand. It's something that you can orient around. And if I mean, so here's a fantasy. Imagine if Jeff Bezos tomorrow was to say, I've just been reading this amazing biography of Wittgenstein, and I think I am a Wittgensteinian, and I'm going to sort of present my Amazon website with, I'm going to pepper it with little quotations of Wittgenstein and sort of say that if you buy with me, you will be part of this kind of transformative change in your life, right? Is that a bad thing, right? Is it, and I think there, for many people, this would be like, you are bastardizing philosophy, right? Like this we are taking philosophy and making it commercial, right? Whereas I think I'm inclined to go the other direction. This is why I so appreciated this essay, is the other way to look at it is that our economic world is merging with the meaning creation world, right? And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that is a fantastic thing, right? Now that might raise all sorts of questions like, well, what is the right way to live then? Because if you have Amazon and Nike and Apple and Microsoft and book, and they're all in this game. Suppose they all get into this game, which they already seem to be have their foot in. Apple had it since uh, Steve Jobs in a way, right? Well, which is the right one, right? And my inclination is to say maybe that's exactly the question we need to give up. Maybe there is no one right one, right? Spirituality maybe isn't about the one thing that everybody should believe, but about every person trying to be the best version of themselves they can be, physically, mentally, emotionally. And what that looks like for each person and each community will differ. And it's okay for it to differ, right? And what we want maybe ultimately is a world where we're able to have that kind of flourishing, as opposed to saying, in order for me to be good, you have to be bad, or I'm going to show that you're wrong. That part, I think, is maybe what we can get away from. But that's this is my last thought for now, right? I mean, I think this set of issues raises this really big question of whether our economic and technological situation can be a force for good, right? Force for good, not only in the way in which, say, traditionally the right in the last 50 years, this is pre sort of the MAGA movement, right? This is the Republicans, say, of the 80s, uh, right? We say, oh, well, we want sort of capitalism can be a force of good because it's going to, help entrepreneurship. It's going to help businesses. That will lift people up. In a way, that was all to say it's going to lift people up materially, right? Now the question, I think, has become almost, because for that view, churches are still the ones doing all the meaning stuff. So capitalism is going to do the economic growth, but then the church gives the meaning space. I think what Shorin is pointing at rightly, I think, is that all these businesses now are gotten into the game, and these startups are start getting into the game of, hey, this kind of quasi-capitalist system can also be the meaning-making system. And we can sort of we can combine these things, and it can the economic situations and the social media and sort of all of this stuff becomes the vehicle for the growth of consciousness, right? As opposed to, though, this is all still part of the everyday crude part of life, but the growth part of the spiritual consciousness raising part has to look like meditation, has to look like prayer, has to look like you are sort of going away from the world, sitting in your room and living a contemplative life internally, right? I think this is kind of pushing against that, saying, no, what if that growth in consciousness is inseparable from, you know, how you present yourself on YouTube or Instagram or wherever. And that seems to me a very healthy. I mean, I'm sure it has all sorts of drawbacks, but I think it seems to me a very healthy development as well, which is one reason why, from my perspective, we're doing this podcast, right? I mean, we're entering this space because if this is a space, then uh, you know, maybe we should contribute to that space being how we would like it to be, rather than sort of writing it off as well. That's just the space of narcissism and people wanting to see themselves on camera and on YouTube, thinking they're sort of reality TV stars. Or it could be we do live in a world where a lot of our cognition is filtered through YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and whatever. So we might as well make these spaces reflect our values and aspirations, right? Yeah.
Sorry, we had to restart the recording due to some technical difficulties. So Bharath was just made a couple of interesting points. Um, one of which was the idea of cultures differing based on these different values that might spring up. And I think that's exactly what's happening. Um, so Sri Aurobindo in the human cycle has this interesting idea of the subjective age, where um, we're no longer going to be oriented around a kind of rationally determined idea of truth. Not that rationality won't be perceived, still be important in this new age. We'll still need to be rational and pay attention to the objective reality, but the important factor will be kind of this subjective sense of what what the different things mean to us, the different structures of our lives. And so I think it, it's a little hard to connect to what exactly he might be talking about if you read that book in a vacuum. But I think this kind of essay, like Shorin goes into here, kind of gives us an idea of what this might actually look like. So it's not just that there's one linear kind of schema where everybody has to be Christian and go to church and follow one moral code and get to one destination at the end of a heaven, but there's this proliferation of different kind of value structures and value systems that are embedded in these different brands, these different kind of cults of personality. Again, I'm kind of using this term kind of maybe not necessarily pejoratively, but it's an interesting borderline of the whether this term has a positive or negative charge. So these different brands, different cultures, cults of personality, these different meaning-making structures will pop up and allow people to kind of work out these differing ideas of what meaning is to them and what gives them meaning. And these structures, are kind of the contents of the subjective age. So yeah, I'm just trying to think of some other examples. So the brands do create these kind of subjective aesthetics, value systems that create those differing pathways. So another interesting point you raised was whether the economic and technological system um, can actually work for us in the meaning space versus the meaning space relegated to churches and other institutions, which are officially providing the meaning function of society. I think that's exactly kind of what's happening. There's this permeability of um, of institutions. So not only are businesses becoming meaning making, but meaning making systems are becoming commercial. So we've talked about, you and I both have talked about the way that this kind of spiritual space is becoming heavily monetized in a way that I think a lot of people are ambiguous about. So there's these different coaching programs and training programs and retreats and all these different things that cost varying levels of money, and there are arguments for and against it. I think it's like one of the strongest arguments is that people who do this kind of work have to be compensated for their labor, and they need to have a way to subsist. And without that, you can't just have a purely a volunteer basis of spirituality, because the people that are most devoted to it, or doing the kind of real groundwork that helps people, can't be compensated. But I think a lot of people are made uneasy by this intersection of spirituality and values and commerce, and feeling that we should be moving in this way, this this way of being that doesn't have these commercial aspects. And I think, again, you can critique it and say that we should all go to the public library and just not be worried about money at all, but the energy of the space really does seem to be moving in this way of these blurring of the world between the commercial and the meaning spaces, because it seems to work for people. I mean, people wouldn't be spending money on these coaching programs, and I count myself among them, if I didn't get something out of them, or if people didn't get something out of them that they feel is beneficial for their meaning making structures and um, their positive contributions to life. Um, so I think it's gonna go both ways. There's gonna be companies that make meaning, and there's gonna be meaning making company, primarily meaning focused um, systems or companies, or however you want to conceive it, to make these experience products or services. Um, so I think it's not necessarily going to stop at just um, kind of spiritual advisement or coaching being the main product. There could be an integration um, of different kinds of activities into those spiritual systems. So by which I mean, I was referencing this business coach, for example, that kind of blurred the line between personal growth and a money making skill. Um, so that's one way of doing it. Or there could be different experiences that are attached to this meaning making activity, and I think retreats are a good example of this, where there's a specific activity that you go to, and you do yoga, and you do lectures and programs that in this um, new environments with new people, um, in a way that gets you away from your everyday life. But they're probably going to be more, and things that we don't necessarily expect. So I'm definitely curious about what might arise, and people might find ways of um, doing things that we haven't thought of. But again, I think Shorin's point is that it's better than this flatland era of nothing having meaning, and just the only meaningful choice being kind of rebelling against the system and listening to grunge music, and that's the only needing to kind of prick yourself with something to feel, by with harsh aggressive music
Right.
to be able to feel anything. I think that's a better way of integrating these things, again, because we see that the old model of kind of putting all the meaning making structure on churches is not going to work, because that's not something that people are feeling is appealing in this day and age for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, do you wanna,
No, no, yeah, I was
yeah,
on. Yeah.
uh, I think yeah, I was sort of thinking that I guess there is a part of me that's torn, because uh, I've sort of, in one way, I've sort of resisted this whole trend. I think when I was a professor, I think what I found, one of the things I found very hard was the thought that academia was turning into a business. And a lot of academics really struggle with that thought. It's somehow taking away from the kind of value that the intellectual supposed life is supposed to be, that it's getting micromanaged now by sort of neoliberal administrators right? And so that kind of the business model has descended into academia in the last 40 years. And for people who are sort of value the life of the mind, this is like a real tension. Like I think hate is not strong a word to use, right? There's this like visceral hate of this idea that this commercialization of academia, right? And I've certainly felt that. I felt it very strongly. Um, right now, I'm doing this. You're a part of it. This online course that's free, and one of the things being free is somehow very meaningful to me, right? And partly because I guess the value of it must be why it means so much to me must be somehow that it is not economics, it is not in the matrix of the economy. Somehow that must be what is resonant for me. But at the same time, I am very much completely aboard, as I've been saying, what Shorin's talking about where he sees the trend is going. I kind of feel like, yes, I want to be fully on board this. And it makes total sense to me that people would take classes in philosophy, spirituality, life coaches, career coaches, these kinds of things, because it's like, okay, if somebody can pay, $100 to take a class or to have a coaching experience for a couple of weeks or whatever, is that bad? Is it bad that the person is earning money that way? I mean, it's 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 hard to see how it is bad because after all, that person has to make a living. They're contributing something, they have to make a living, and the person who's the consumer, I mean, should they spend that $100 instead on going to the casino or going to a restaurant? I mean, like, okay, if they're going to spend that money, they might as well spend it on something that is meaning generating and contributing to sort of the culture and the community in that way. Um, so, uh, yeah, I guess I was just your what you're saying somehow evoked for me this tension in my own thinking that's very vivid for me between sort of on the one hand, I have this kind of very old-fashioned sense of even the professors are prostituting themselves kind of feeling. Um, but it's like, but it's perfectly fine to actually have a business of spirituality and philosophy, right? Somehow these two are clearly not, they're clearly in tension with each other. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'm still thinking through that tension. I have a feeling that it's leaning more in the direction of, yeah, it's okay for this, for philosophy and spirituality and sort of human potential movement and sort of to somehow get merged with the economy stuff like that. I'm sort of, I think, leaning in that direction. And but I haven't at a personal level, I'm sort of trying to sift through the consequences of that for me, like how I orient to the world, right? Because it does involve a change in orientation, and it's kind of like uh, am I going to let the cultural forces carry me along, and then the philosophy becomes a way of dealing how to go down that river as I'm carried along? Or is the philosophy going to be something that is safeguarded against these cultural forces, right? And it's something that is on a separate level than all of these cultural forces. And I guess everything that I think history and sort of just human the evolution of human nature and how we're entwined with our surroundings. I very much believe there's this idea in the philosophy of mind, which has now gotten, I think, out into the general public because there are several books written with, it's called the extended mind idea. And so on this extended mind, it started in the philosophy of, some philosophy professors defended it. But now psychologists and others have taken it, and I just saw a book recently with that title. Uh, right. And so on this extended mind hypothesis, our minds are literally constituted by the cultural objects around us, right? So it's not like the mind is this thing inside of us internally, sort of as it were, hermetically sealed from this outside world, which is just physical stuff. But that, the classic example is that our phones now are a part of our mind. So they've sort of become like our external memory banks. And this is one reason why we're so attached to them is the where the cognition ends here in the head and where it filters into how I use my phone or my laptop or whatever is you can't make a sharp distinction. But now if that extended mind kind of view is right, which I'm inclined to think it is, then given that the external objects are created in the matrix of this economic branding process, right? Then in some ways, my mind is itself constituted by these branding processes, right? And I think there's a dystopian way of thinking of that. I think the classic image is something like how it is in the Blade Runner or something. You're just walking around and you constantly see advertisements everywhere, inundating you 24 hours a day. Everywhere you look, there's just advertising bombarding you all the time. And you're kind of like dehumanized as a result of this, right? And you're just sort of disconnected from it all. Um, and I think the kind of thing that Shorin is pointing at is perhaps a different, less dystopian version of maybe it doesn't have to be that kind of we are just desensitized by advertising, but that the advertising itself can become meaning making because maybe the advertisements are like can be mini haikus or mini aphorisms or they could just be all sorts of things that are part and parcel of how we think and grow. And the people we sort of want to emulate are not necessarily gurus or, philosophers with white beards and sort of saintly faces and smiles, but just people who resonate for us in a deep, deep level in this matrix. And maybe that's kind of where we're headed, and I think it's uh, that doesn't seem to me so bad. I think we just maybe need to get used to it and wrap our mind around it and sort of see what uh, what that would look like.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about academia because it seems to me that the issue is not that it was once this perfect bastion of being separated from the market and now it's market, but it seems like one of the big problems is that it's insufficiently integrated into the or one of the angles is that it's insufficiently integrated in the market and that it no longer serves the kind of job training purposes that it once served, and so it's kind of removed from its economic basis, and then the life of the mind has no tethering to anything, and then loses its functioning, because if there's no economic basis for the reason why people have to pay this money to be able to get into a better job because jobs aren't valuing the skills that are gained in college,
Right.
then there's not going to be this economic basis for supporting that life of the mind and that inquiry. So I think that renegotiation is going to be a part a part of the future of academia. I don't know what that looks like, because I'm more, um, yeah, I'm my personal efforts are kind of in this sphere of the new philosophical structures that are taking place outside academia, where you can participate directly in the life of the mind, although it might be mediated by a certain amount of direct subsidy or direct payment to the philosopher for getting to engage in the class or the community or whatever. It seems to me a more direct exchange for supporting the life of the mind, which by itself, without connection to find it kind of the ideas being exploited for economic benefit, for example. If the ideas can't be exploited in that way,
Right.
then there has to be some sort of kind of direct subsidy of the life of the mind. Um, so I think academics who haven't made peace with that are kind of not being fully honest with themselves about the exchange that's happening in the world. And I think that gets to, yeah, there's this notion that everything is a process of exchanging one thing for another, whether and that doesn't need to be, uh there's a way of saying, this is just capitalism, but if you're not providing anything to the broader society besides your own intellectual gratification, then there's not really any reason for the societies to support you. um I think
I
there
think
is a
the
value
criticism
for,
I would
yeah.
say, no, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that there is a sense in which kind of like foundational science or foundational philosophy does give something to society in in kind of a long-term bet, and that's why I think that there's a place for government funding of these things to some extent, but at the same time there has to be some sort of contribution to back to, uh yeah, there needs to be a renegotiation of the economic dimension there. um yeah, yeah,
Actually, I
so
was going to go in
mhm.
the other direction,
Okay.
right? I think you were sort of, it seemed like right at the end there, you were kind of pulling back your criticism a little bit, right?
Mm,
Right. And I was I wanted to press the pedal on that criticism,
mm,
and actually push it more, because I think one of the things that seems to me is happening with sort of how academics are seen in culture is that it is really hard, I think, for people to know how you emulate academics, right? So if we go back to this idea that people are driven at a gut level with who they want to be like, right? Sort of who they are aspired to be like, what about them jumps out to them, right? Uh, then I think academics are really stuck in a corner now because uh, the activity of academics, for the most part, is not transferable to the public, right? So the academic life is one where you write research papers or you teach, where you have this kind of, if you're doing a research paper or book, then you are sort of this expert talking to other experts, right? Or if you're teaching, then you're speaking, and then you kind of have these, you know, 10, 20, 200 people, kids or students listening to you, right? Neither of these models of research or teaching have any analog in day-to-day life, right? There's no room for ordinary life. There's no room you walk into as an ordinary person and you're like, I'm now going to tell you what I've been thinking for 50 minutes, and you can ask me questions for another 20 minutes, and that'll be it. And we'll do that 2, 3 times a week, right? There is no auto space to sort of think, oh, I want to be like that, right? If you want to be like that, then you actually literally have to try to go become a professor, right? And there aren't enough jobs, so you can't literally go try to become a professor, right? So there's a sense in which the model has sort of petered out because at a certain point, I think it's become that I think this is where I think academics are sort of living in sort of bad faith when they make the objection that it's because of neoliberalism that we've sort of lost touch, right? No, it's not because of neoliberalism alone, or even mainly. It's that it's not obvious that the academic model could ever be scaled to the general population. That was always a question mark. It was supposed to be for a small percentage of the population. That's how the academic model was set up in the last, at least in modern academia, you know, in the last 200 years. It wasn't meant for mass education the way it started after World War II, right? And so that tension is sort of pushing people sort of from not seeing their role models in professors. I think the same thing is happening the converse side, right? Getting this from the Aurobindo influenced side is in some ways the ashram model, which had a huge influence say, in American counterculture in the 50s and 60s. That counterculture was defined against the economic infrastructure of life, right? Jobs, making money, in all of this stuff, as if the spiritual life is something that rejects all of that, that it might go back into, that it might connect to a community only on this kind of, we're starting all over again in an almost non-economic communal model where we're going to start over again on a model where all of us have a shared spiritual ideology. That's what binds us, and that's what community is going to be. And I think part of what we're seeing from that angle is that is also petering it out, because the idea that you're going to find a common shared spiritual community you could share with, some people, but you're not going to find that with everybody, because you're still going to have to meet people across these differences. And that ends up being that right now our main connection to each other is through economy and technology. And even neighborhoods and whatnot are filtered through technology and our economic relations to each other. And so I think both the economic model and the ashram model have sort of are kind of winding down. And so the meaning creation of those activities is getting, I think, rechanneled into the into the mode of activity in which we buy groceries or clothes or anything else, so that it makes perfect sense then to sort of think, okay, I'm also going to buy my philosophy class. I'm going to buy a couple of hours with my life guide, right? And sort of these things they're not living in opposed terrains, but just sort of merging and fusing together, which is great in some ways. I'm sure it has lots of potential for abuse of various kinds, but I suppose that's true with anything.
Yeah, it's for sure. I actually don't think the ashram model is necessarily going to die down, but I think it will change. So I think for the Sri Aurobindo ashram in particular, I think there are people for whom that's still enough of a binding ideology. What I find for myself is that I really like the people that I meet in the Sri Aurobindo community, but there's still this divergence where uh, I don't know if I have enough of in common at a cultural level to want to kind of just be around those sorts of people, as opposed to just finding different cultural currents that I resonate with in the broader society. Even though this is one of the most important commitments in my life, I don't know that I'd have enough shared ideology. So I think what brought it together was the charismatic influence of the central personality figures. That is what can allow things to work out. Um, and different people might feel different ways about the Sri Aurobindo ashram, whether there's continuity and things like that. So I don't want to speak for everybody. Um, but what I think will be possible is that new charismatic figures will arise that can create new ashrams and new community structures. I think the open question is always about the economic dimension. What is it that? But if people are able to unlock that by like different forms of yeah, maybe different economic structures that they invent. Um, like I keep coming back to this example of the business coach. So if you have a personal growth thing um, that rests on top of a viable economic model, then you solve a lot of the problems that these spiritual communities didn't solve completely, which is how do we make this subsist in an economic way. But if you are teaching people how to make money in a skill that works in the economic way society is laid out on top, and add an ideology on top of that, then you have a viable self perpetuating thing. So I think people are going to figure out ways of making the economics work. And um, like we were talking about the network school a couple of months ago, a project by Balaji Srinivasan. I thought that was an interesting example of making things work, connecting these crypto projects as a way of making money to this kind of lifestyle aspect um, of being healthy, and some other aspects of that program that I don't remember. Um, but yeah, so if you can find a way to connect the economic basis to the ideology, I think that's what will make these new projects work. Um, I also wanted to touch on a point that you raised earlier about, feeling like these cultural forces are leading this way towards this kind of monetized engagement with meaning, and you feeling like you're all for it. And I just want to, because I think I feel the same way, that I think this is the way the energy is going, and there's a sense in which um, like a retreat or a coaching service or something with a certain dollar value is actually has more of a sort of aura than something that has a free service. Although I'm really enjoying your free course, but uh, just from the perspective of the aura, there's a certain like cachet to these experiences, and I think, but I
I
I want
think
I
because
want to
that's
respect.
is it because free sounds like it's not like amateur? Free
I
sounds
think
like
there are these kinds of connotations like that, like amateur or or not valued in a very
right.
sense. And I think that it might be unfortunate that is the connotation, but I really want to emphasize why, like I want to call out the unnaturalness of this new conception and why people are wary of it, because I think it is deeply weird that people are um, kind of monetizing these sorts of experiences. And even though I think this is the direction that things are going, I also want to be sensitive to the dimension in which it feels weird, or like we're commodifying our experience. Um, and I want to respect that part of it, because I think that is a dimension that is like there's something like the exchange value is um does change, because there are ways that I'm just trying to think of another example. Um, yeah, there are just ways that exchange can uh like a good example is the way that marketing is going these days. Like a lot of people are talking about how nobody wants to click on advertisements anymore, so you just have to like kind of give value in an authentic way, then eventually people will want to buy your service. um, so in the previous cultural arrangement, there's kind of like this distinction between professional and personal lives, where in the professional world we have this business ideology where we have certain kinds of exchanges, and in our personal lives we just do things without any sort of notion of exchange. Although even in that ways, people have critiqued like the way that marriage functions as a kind of economic system, and there are different intellectual critiques you can make of that. But still, there was this general conception that there's this boundary. But the idea is that you like give content authentically, and then you just have to like be so authentic that you're just have no intention be that people buy your service. Uh, and that is supposed to like replace the old system of advertising, where there's a kind of conventional separation between the the program that you're getting and the fact that somebody's trying to sell you something, it just it's it's a weird change of conception, and I want to honor that part of a part of people's reactions, my own reactions, that say that this is even though that this is the way that things are going, there is something that is off feeling about it, or can be. So let's try to be mindful of that and see what the new rules are and what feels right and what is right as we move into this new territory, and not just to say that we're just going to go headlong into this. And uh, so yeah, again, I maybe I sound like I'm hedging for my previous points again, but I want to be mindful of both those sides.
No, I think it sounds very measured to me. I think that is that I think that kind of reflects, it's kind of like my own ambivalence a little bit, right? I think there is an ambivalence of uh, uh, I mean, if one jumps in headlong into the monetary aspect of it and sort of says, okay, yeah, right, then I guess what is it that I would like to resist about that? Or what does it mean to do it mindfully, right?
Mm.
What would it be to do it mindfully, and what would it be to do it sort of non-mindfully, right? And um, I guess if I think about the non-mindfully, uh, the worry is that, oh, we will just all right. So here's the worry, right? So it would be like maybe the way that people are drawn to Elon Musk. That would be a worry, right? Because I think people are drawn now to Elon Musk, especially now that given his political views. I could pick somebody on the left also. I don't want to necessarily make this a particular, I mean, political issue, but it's sort of like, oh, he's the richest person in the world. And that has an automatic appeal for a lot of people. Then on top of that, you add the kind of personality he has, what his beliefs, how he carries himself. It resonates for a lot of people intuitively, right? This now becomes uh, super dependent on. I mean, now it starts to feel like a cult, right? Right? Because if you don't have the infrastructure of, okay, no, the person is just a person, but rather what matters is the book, or what matters are the values or the community. What matters is something that is defined by something greater than economics. Then it feels like it's a way of saying money isn't everything, right? In fact, it's just one thing, but there's more to life than money. You could be poor and be wise. You could be poor and live a meaningful, good life. You could be rich and live a non-meaningful, or maybe life that is sort of where you're struggling in many, many ways that people don't want to emulate. You don't want the person might themselves not be comfortable with that. So if we separate, if so, there's a very natural way we want to say that, look, money the isn't the marker of meaning in that sense. You could have it just like looks aren't the marker of meaning. It's not like Brad Pitt is going to have has a more meaningful life because he is handsome than somebody who isn't handsome in that way, right? So I think it seems part of whatever we want to think of as personal growth and spirituality and growing sort of in terms of our psyche and higher levels of consciousness. It seems fundamental to that rising to those higher levels of consciousness that one is able to somehow get beyond physical looks, whether one looks like Brad Pitt. I'm not going to just go sort of do everything Brad Pitt does because, he's good looking. Similarly, I'm not going to go do whatever the billionaires are doing just because they happen to be billionaires. I think the anxiety might be that if the spiritual realm and the monetary realm kind of fuse together, so that, you know, uh, if Deepak Chopra and Eckhart Tolle and Sadhguru and Thich Nhat Hanh, I mean, it's hard to imagine Thich Nhat Hanh as a billionaire, but if we could imagine him being at least a multi-millionaire, given his brand. Yeah, if he was sort of monetize it in some way, he would be a rich person, right? He has a well-established brand now going back 50 years, 40 years. There seems something to sort of that. Would it help me to dislodge myself from my sort of lower instincts if I am sort of relating to the people in this way, right? And there seems something valuable about the fact that Christ didn't have money, that the Buddha was, sort of outside of the realm. It was a way of saying, hey, this is something disconnected from where you are in the economic matrix, right? And I think part of the worry, I guess, is if these things kind of fuse together, what can give us that sense of the higher life um, is is not defined by how much how many followers you have, right? If I am also get into the sort of philosophy teacher business, right? And I'm going to offer courses, and this is something I guess I've been feeling. And if I'm sort of honest with myself and I sort of think, okay, if I'm going to start offering courses online and charge people, there is a gut instinct of like, I'm behind I'm sort of falling behind because I'm coming late to the game. And will I look like I'm not a good teacher because I don't have as many students, or I don't have as much infrastructure, or I don't know how to set up my camera in the right way so that it has the right background, and all of these things of like that I look professional, and am I going to be able to brand myself in the right way? Suddenly all of those things seem not irrelevant to the question of the philosophy itself, right? I mean, it seems to be part and parcel of what I have to think about to, and I guess it's a question of, okay, that just something that I need to do because that's kind of where the game is going? Or is it like, oh, is that like maybe teenagers now will know all that from the get-go. So it's not such a big deal for them. It's like, it's like I don't know how to write. And now the current medium is like, yeah, we're going to start writing. It's that maybe this is how the pre-Socratic people who are committed to Homeric poetry felt about Plato writing. They're like, damn this guy. He, he's writing and we're supposed to learn how to write. Like, no, we just memorize thousands and thousands of lines, and that's how we're going to do it. Right. And so is it like that? Maybe it is like that. Maybe it's like that. Maybe like, for people growing up now, all of this infrastructure is just going to be so automatic that then they can just do the philosophy and the meaning stuff with all of this infrastructure as the ABCs for them, right? Whereas for somebody like me, the infrastructure just feels like it's, whoa, this is all like in this economic realm that I have to sort of learn as a second language, in middle age, feels like, oh, this is so complicated.
Hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like we both are wary of this, have some reservations about it, but on the other hand, uh, judging from our earlier comments earlier in the discussion, are both um, kind of like Shorin saying, we have this wary acceptance that this might be a development that has some positive aspects to it. So I think that
Yeah.
might be a good place to close our discussion. Yeah, so this is a great discussion, and Hope the listeners found it valuable. So thanks, Bharath.
All right. Thanks, Ravi. Yeah, really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it was great.